Good morning. I'm going to start today's lesson with a story. I want you to listen carefully to my story. The story is called The War of Ghosts. Two young men from Egulac went down to the river to hunt seals, and while they were there, it became foggy and calm. Then they heard war cries, and they thought, maybe this is a war party. They escaped to the shore and hid behind a log. Now canoes came up, and they heard the noise of paddles, and saw one canoe coming up to them. There were 5 men in the canoe, and they said, "What do you think? We wished to take you along. We are going up the river to make war on the people." One of the young men said, "I have no arrows." "Arrows are in the canoe," they said. "I will not go along. I might be killed. My relatives do not know where I have gone. But you," he said, turning to the other, "may go with them." So one of the young men went, but the other returned home. And the warriors went on up the river to a town on the other side of Kalama. The people came down to the water, and they began to fight, and many were killed. But presently the young man heard one of the warriors say, "Quick, let us go home. That Indian has been hit." Now he thought, "Oh, they are ghosts." He did not feel sick, but they said he had been shot. So the canoes went back to Egulac, and the young man went ashore to his house and made a fire. And he told everybody and said, "Behold, I accompanied the ghosts, and we went to fight. Many of our fellows were killed, and many of those who attacked us were killed. They said I was hit, and I did not feel sick." He told it all, and then became quiet. When the sun rose, he fell down. Something black came out of his mouth. His face became contorted. The people jumped up and cried. He was dead. All right, so I'm going to explain the purpose of that story at the end of the lesson. All right, now I'm going to read you something else. This is a bit of a riddle. It's not really a good riddle, but it's something of a riddle. So the procedure is actually quite simple. First, you arrange items into different groups. Of course, one pile may be sufficient depending on how much there is to do. If you have to go somewhere else due to lack of facilities, that is the next step. Otherwise, you are pretty well set. It is important not to overdo things. That is, it is better to do a few things at once than too many. In the short run, this may not seem important, but complications can easily arise. A mistake can be expensive as well. At first, the whole procedure will seem complicated. Soon, however, it will become another facet of life. It is difficult to foresee any end to the necessity for this task in the immediate future, but then one can never tell. After the procedure is completed, one arranges the material in different groups again. Then they can be put into their appropriate places. Eventually, they will be used once more, and the whole cycle will then have to be repeated. However, this is a part of life. So take a moment and think. Obviously, every sentence I just read is intelligible. But what does it mean? Maybe you're mystified. Now I'm going to read it again. Maybe you've guessed what it's talking about. I don't know, because I can't talk to you because of wretched online learning stuff. But let me read it again. This time I'm going to read the title first. The title is Washing Clothes. The procedure is quite simple. First, you arrange items in different groups. Of course, one pile may be sufficient depending on how much there is to do. If you have to go somewhere else due to lack of facilities, that's the next step. Otherwise, you're pretty well set. It's important not to overdo things. That is, it's better to do a few things than too many. In the short run, this may not seem important, but complications can easily arise. A mistake can be expensive as well. At first, the whole procedure will be complicated. Soon, however, it will become just another facet of life. It's difficult to foresee an end to the necessity for this task in the immediate future, but then one can never tell. After the procedure is completed, one arranges the material in different groups again. Then they can be put into their appropriate places. Eventually, they will be used once more, and the whole cycle will then have to be repeated. However, that is a part of life. So, washing clothes. And the context here that we're going to introduce today is, in memory, is looking at schemas. So that'll be part of our discussion. So this was just an illustration of schemas that we're going to come back to. Okay, so you're going to want to take your notes out. And I wanted to visit a couple of the readings I've assigned, so we'll start with that first. So as soon as I figure out which screen to share. All right, so here's this New York Times article, the Midtown hammer attack, having to do with false memory. And so it says, Wednesday morning, this is obviously years ago, Anthony O'Grady stood in front of a Dunkin' Donuts in Manhattan, heard a ruckus. The police chased a man, shoot him down. Moments later, O'Grady talked to a reporter and said the wounded man was in flight. He looked like he was trying to get away, O'Grady said. Another person named Sunny Khalsa had been riding her bike. She saw the event. She contacted the Times newsroom and said, I saw a man who was handcuffed and was shot. I might be crazy, but that's what I saw. At 3 p.m. later that day, the police department released surveillance videotape showing that both these people were wrong. The man who had been shot was not trying to get away. He was actually chasing an officer, swinging a hammer at her head. Behind both was the officer's partner who shot the man. Miss Khalsa did not see David Barrell being shot while in handcuffs. He is, as the video and photographs show, freely swinging the hammer, then lying on the ground with his arms at his side. He was handcuffed a few moments later, well after he had been shot. So we have no evidence that says that either of these people were trying to do anything wrong. It's just that this is the way their memories worked. And it goes back and looks at some of these studies that we've talked about and the research of Elizabeth Loftus. And then, so looking at the conclusion there, Miss Khalsa said, I was totally embarrassed after watching the video. She now believes that she saw the initial encounter, looked away because she's on her bike. In that moment, the man began the attack, which lasted about 3 seconds until he was shot. I didn't see the civilian run or swing a hammer, she said. In my mind, I assumed he was just standing there and then was in handcuffs. With all the accounts in the news of police officers in shootings, I assumed the police were taking advantage of someone who was easily discriminated against, she added. Based on what I saw, I assumed the worst, even though I had looked away. Her own certainty was gone. It makes me think about everything in life. So this is obviously over the last probably 10 years, right? There have been all kinds of examples in the news of police brutality. Whether that's in the case in Minnesota where the guy was shot in his car, or there was the kid in Ohio, the Ferguson situation, etc. And so here we have an example of how this woman who took the time to call the Times, because of this, I'm gonna call it a schema in her brain, that cops are brutal to innocent people, she filled in details that didn't exist. So she said, I assumed the guy was just standing there in handcuffs and then the police shot him. I assumed the worst. I assumed the police were taking advantage of someone who was easily discriminated against. And then she called the news about it. Even though in her mind, she was certain she saw police brutality. But in reality, thankful for the surveillance video, it wasn't really what happened. So how false memories based on, it's not even having to do with leading questions. It wasn't like they asked this witness, what did you see? Did you see the cops act brutally towards this person? Because in her mind, she had a schema, we'll come back to that term. She had a schema, she had a framework in her mind for police brutality. Her brain filled in what must have happened because of her negative sense with the police. And that's scary. Right now, I apologize for the really cruddy, I tried to make a PDF out of this using my document camera, and it just did not turn out well. So I apologize. But you have young eyes. So this is on Gordon Bauer in state-dependent memory, and the study of looking at how moods affect memory. And so looking at people memorize things happy, tested happy, memorized happy, tested sad, etc. And what they figured out was that if your memory works the best when you're happy, when you encode the memory, and you're happy when you recall it, things work the best, or in the same case with sad. But if your emotional state when you encode the memory is the same as the emotional state when you recall it. He also talks about context dependent memory here. That's this part here looking at, we mentioned that in the notes. So you see this little graph here, percent recalled, learned sad, and then mood at recall, happy, versus learned happy, recalled when happy. So you just drastic difference there. All right, so looking at a couple other things here, it says we may settle on a way of solving a problem that doesn't work or works less well than an alternative might, and yet we blindly stay fixed to that same set of ideas or procedures. Now we noted in that context that many people find it helpful to take a break. And so they're saying, like, sometimes maybe our memories, if we're sitting at wherever we study or do our homework, and we get stuck on a math problem or something, and we just think about it, we keep screwing it up. Sometimes it's helpful to like take a walk, to change states, to change settings, context, maybe to find an answer. What I found most interesting about this article, it says state-dependent memory could also color our remembrances of things past, perhaps more often than we realize. So we studied a large sample of people over 15 months. Of these, some became clinically depressed over the course of the study, and some recovered during the study. So 15 months is a long time, right? Among the questions they were asked was what their relations with their parents had been like when they were young. Depressed subjects, more than non-depressed ones, tended to report that their parents had been cold and rejecting and their childhoods unhappy. This on its face might tempt us to think of parental coldness and indifference as factors that might lead to depression. So in other words, you're thinking, what causes depression? Well, it could be if your parents were not very warm and loving. That's a conjecture. So they say here, we might think based on this study that depressed subjects, more than non-depressed ones, reported their parents had been cold and rejecting. Now, prepare to be astounded, right? The trouble was these reports were characteristic of participants while they were depressed. When interviewed in a non-depressed state, the same people, the same participants, described their childhoods and relations with their parents in ways that were indistinguishable from participants who were never depressed. We have to wonder were these people's memories of their childhood influenced by state-dependent memory? Perhaps people who are depressed are more likely to remember depressed and depressing events about their childhoods or anything else than people who are not depressed. If so, then even if the depressed people's childhoods were really no more unhappy than anyone else's, they might, because they are now depressed, remember the unhappy side of it more readily. We could then get a very misleading picture of the relation between childhood events and depression. We do not know that this is so, but the possibility is worth bearing in mind. So, interesting, right? When a person's depressed, they remember depressing things about their childhood. When a person is not depressed, that same person is not depressed, they remember happier relations in their childhood in this study. And so we're tempted to think, oh, cold parenting equals, indicator for depression later. But what this study showed was that it's really more about a memory thing. When we're depressed, we remember depressing things. When we're happy, we remember happy things. And so they've done a similar study looking at siblings, and they've showed that in a family, right, if you have a sibling who's not depressed, they have good memories of childhood, and they have a depressed child who has bad memories about the same childhood. So the depressed adult rather, speaking about his childhood, might say something like, oh, my parents fought a lot and there's a lot of tension in the house and whatever. Meanwhile, their sibling is saying, oh, I don't know, my parents didn't fight any more than anyone else, and I don't remember them really fighting. I just remember more happier things. So the state you are currently in heavily influences things you remember. This is true about, things like school too, where if you're having a very good season at school, you might then, when asked to think about memories about school, you might mention very happy things. If you're going through a very stressful, trying time at school, maybe things aren't going well with your friends, maybe you're angry with a teacher, that would never happen, right? Or whatever the case may be, then your memories about school are going to be clouded by that current state that you're in. So that's something to be aware of. The article goes on to explain about Sirhan, who assassinated Robert Kennedy, and how he couldn't remember things, and then they hypnotized him, returned him to his agitated state that he was in when he committed the assassination, and he was able to recall what he did. So using hypnosis to return a person to the state of mind they were in when they did something. And then lastly, it says, of course, we do not know for a fact that this is what's going on, but it does seem more plausible than an account in terms of repression, which would depend on a state of high anxiety or guilt for which there is no evidence. So in addition, state-dependent memory has been demonstrated by a direct experiment. In contrast, and this may come as a surprise, the Freudian notion of repression has never been demonstrated under controlled conditions. So repression, and this was something that came up in the Loftus research, the idea of repression. So Freud suggested this as a defense mechanism, which we haven't studied Freud extensively yet. But the idea is, if something traumatic happens in your life, you bury it. Your mind, as a way to help you cope with life, buries the memories deep into the recesses of your brain. And your behavior is influenced by those repressed memories. Like you might be depressed or have anxiety or whatever the case may be because of these repressed memories. That's the theory that Freud started. However, looking at the research from Loftus and looking at this Gordon Bauer thing, it's to be noted that repressed memories, have never been demonstrated under controlled conditions, but false memories leading, memory manipulation in the Loftus case, and then in this case, state-dependent memory. These are documented, studied things. So it's much more likely that repression may not exist. And or exists the way that Freud thought it did anyway. Okay, so I think what I would like you to do now is I want you to write out, without going back to listen to the beginning of the video, I want you to write out with as much detail as you can remember the story of the War of Ghosts. So take out a piece of paper right now. Don't go back to listen to the beginning of the video again. Just write out as much as you can remember about the strange story I started off with, the War of Ghosts. And then we'll go from there. So you do that now, and we'll come back to that.